Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Science of Mom, a research-based guide to your baby's first year, by Alice Callahan, narrated by Suzanne Toren. Introduction. I was a scientist first. I started working in research labs as a college student, then as a lab technician, and then went on to graduate school for a PhD in nutritional biology. By the time my husband and I decided we were ready for a baby, I was a postdoctoral fellow studying fetal physiology. For the previous decade of my life, I'd been working to understand the world through the lens of science. I asked questions and sought answers by designing and conducting experiments in the lab. I pored over journal articles, trying to make sense of my data and figure out what important questions to ask next. My job was to measure, analyze, and explain. If I felt lost, then the way out of darkness was always to learn more, maybe by repeating an experiment or immersing myself in the scientific literature until things started to look a little clearer. It should come as no surprise, then, that when I didn't get pregnant in the first couple of months of trying, I tackled it in the best way I knew how, with science. I measured my basal body temperature and tracked my cervical mucus. I recorded my data in a spreadsheet and searched for patterns in color-coded graphs. I pulled out my reproductive physiology textbook to brush up on ovulation and how to optimize our chances at fertilization. It's hard to say whether any of this helped me to get pregnant any faster, but it did at least give me a feeling of control, though perhaps at the expense of romance. When I eventually did get pregnant and became a mother, this same story played out again and again with different details. Pregnancy and childbirth were just the beginning. Caring for my daughter, C, brought lots more questions. Where should she sleep? And when could I expect her to sleep through the night? When should she start solid foods? And what should I feed her? Should I be worried about vaccine safety? Between feeding and rocking, changing and bouncing, and soothing and singing, I found myself digging into the science of parenting. At about the same time, I left the research lab so that I could spend more time with C and explore other career paths, but I missed talking about science with like-minded colleagues. I started the Science of Mom blog as a place to share and discuss what I was learning about parenting, and I was thrilled to find a community of equally inquisitive parents looking for solid science. My blog readers were fascinated by the complexities of the science and always ready with new questions, which inspired me to keep researching and writing. At some point, I wanted to be able to develop these topics in a more cohesive manner, and that journey became this book. Why do we look to science for answers to parenting questions? For most of human history, how we cared for our babies was passed quietly from generation to generation, one mother to the next. It varied around the world, and it changed over time, but it was informed by culture, environment, and necessity, not science. But for our generation, new parenthood means making a huge number of decisions with little familial or cultural guidance. Most of us live far away from the parents and grandparents, aunts and uncles, and brothers and sisters who might have guided us into parenthood in generations past. Instead, we have unlimited advice from the Internet, a resource that empowers us to find our own answers, but at the same time overwhelms us with confusing information. If our babies won't nap, or we're struggling with breastfeeding, we can ask Google for answers or solicit opinions from social networks like Facebook and Twitter. Very quickly, we find ourselves in a minefield of conflicting information and opinions, often paired with a little judgment from all sides. Science is a tool that can help us get closer to the truth in the midst of all this confusion. It can help us to sidestep the opinions and philosophies and anecdotes that fuel parenting debates. We look to science not to confirm what we want to believe or to prove others wrong, but rather to make the best decisions we can as parents. It isn't that science has all the answers to our parenting questions. For some questions, like those that are medical in nature, science can be a great guide. For others, like parenting practices, it can often only give us clues that we then have to figure out how to apply to our own families. The truth is, from a scientific standpoint, parenting is an immensely complicated thing to study. How do we sort through and quantify so many variables, along with all the differences between babies and families, and statistically make some sense of it all? Something so complex can rarely be reduced to a right way and a wrong way. What science can do is zoom out to look at large numbers of babies and families to reveal patterns and averages and ranges of normal. It can give us a broader perspective that can be hard to find during the day-to-day tasks of caring for a baby. It can reveal risks and benefits that we may not have considered, allowing us to approach decisions in an objective way. Science may not offer a protocol for parenting, like the procedures that I perfected in my research lab, but it can help us make smart decisions for our families. Science can also help us rise above parenting controversies. In many cases, if you carefully study the data, as I did in my research for this book, you see that there's rarely a strong case for everyone doing things in the same way. There's plenty of room for parents to make different choices about how their baby eats and sleeps, for example. When you understand the limitations of the science, you are empowered to follow your heart and your child's lead. And in cases where the science gives us a clearer answer, it can help us make decisions more confidently. We don't have to waste our energy arguing or defending ourselves because we've looked at the evidence and we're comfortable with our choices. This frees up valuable time and energy to focus on our babies, take a nap, or work on things important to us, instead of scouring conflicting internet articles for nuggets of truth. I begin this book in Chapter 1 with a sort of crash course in evidence-based parenting. If we want to examine parenting decisions in a scientific way, then we have to understand how science works, how to parse through many studies to find the most relevant ones, and how to interpret research in a meaningful way. This outline will give you an idea of how I approached each topic in this book, and it should also prepare you to tackle your own questions with science as your guide. In Chapters 2 and 3, I zoom in on a few medical questions important to newborn babies, including when we should cut the umbilical cord and why newborns receive an injection of vitamin K and a smear of antibiotics in their eyes. These may be small questions in the scheme of a baby's first year of life, but they each provide a fascinating case study in the history and science of newborn medicine. In Chapter 4, I step away from decision-making and appreciate new babies as scientists do, for their incredible abilities to sense and explore their new world with touch, sound, sight, and smell. Understanding our newborns sets the stage for how we care for them responsively and how the parent-child relationship develops over time. In the rest of the book, I examine some of the biggest questions and sources of angst for parents. Breastfeeding and bottle feeding, Chapter 5. Sleep safety and bed sharing, Chapter 6. Baby sleep patterns, Chapter 7. Vaccine safety, Chapter 8. Starting solid foods, Chapter 9. And healthy nutrition for the older baby, Chapter 10. As I researched and wrote each chapter of the book, I read hundreds of scientific papers, talked to scientists, and interviewed parents for their real-life stories. I looked for answers, but I also wasn't afraid to investigate and question the parts of science where things are still uncertain. and that is often where I found some of the most interesting stories. I didn't write this book pretending to be a parenting expert. I am just a mom with big questions, and I have the scientific training and the curiosity to dig for the answers. I didn't set out to argue one side or the other on controversial topics. Instead, I've tried to be honest about what the science does and doesn't tell us, even when that might be different from the simplified recommendations handed down to us from parenting authority figures. I loved getting buried in convoluted literature searches, trying to find some kind of truth that could be useful to you and me. Thanks for coming along on this journey with me. I hope it makes your job as a parent a little easier, and maybe more interesting, too. 1. Show Me the Science. A crash course in evidence-based parenting. Until I became pregnant, my science life and my real life rarely converged. I spent long hours in the laboratory and in reading and writing scientific papers, but for the most part, when I went home, I left the science behind. I saw the scientific process as a way for me to understand my little corner of research, not as a helpful tool in making everyday decisions. All of that changed when I became pregnant. Suddenly I had a lot of questions and a lot of decisions to make, and these felt really important. I realized that as a parent, I was tasked with the responsibility of making decisions for another person, and I wanted to get this right. I had to figure out what chemicals and procedures in my research lab might pose a health risk to my baby. I wanted to eat right and exercise well for an optimal pregnancy. I wanted to plan and prepare for the birth in the same detail-oriented way that I mapped out a protocol in the lab. And science, I realized, was a tool that could help me do this. And best of all, I knew how to use it. Good data comforted me. As a scientist, surely I could make this an evidence-based pregnancy and an evidence-based baby. Science did help me to make some decisions, particularly in how I planned for childbirth and parenting, but I also found that the reality often deviated from the plan. No amount of planning could prepare me for how a labor contraction would feel as it screamed through my body, or for how I would cope when my baby had been up for hours, needing me in the middle of the night. I learned that part of parenting is accepting that it usually won't go as planned, and that we can't control every variable. We have to experience it for ourselves and learn as we go. We adjust and adapt, and then go back to the science with new questions, wanting to learn more. Many of the areas of research that I investigated for this book were much more complex than any scientific question I had tackled before. I was accustomed to cell culture or animal studies, where I could control nearly every variable, tweaking the one in question to determine its importance or to get my experimental conditions just right. But parenting questions have so many more variables. For example, most of us at some point wonder how we can help our babies to sleep better at night. But how can we answer that with science? We can't put babies in a laboratory and control every variable that might affect their sleep. Babies are born to different parents who have different philosophies and cultural traditions that they carry with them into parenting. Babies live in different types of environments with varying amounts of light, noise, and activity around them. Even if we could control all of those things, the babies themselves are different, born with their own unique personalities and needs. All of this natural variation between babies and between families makes parenting research difficult to do and even harder to interpret. Taking an evidence-based approach to parenting means being aware of these limitations and approaching the science with skepticism. Science can be such a valuable tool, but only if we understand how it works. We have to be able to find relevant studies, judge their quality, interpret their results with skepticism, and then figure out whether they can inform our own approaches to parenting. In this book, I explore what I think are some of the most interesting parenting decisions in a baby's first year. But it isn't a complete guide by any means. This book probably won't answer all of your questions, but I think you'll find that many of the concepts introduced here will help you to tackle other questions on your own. To help you understand how I approached my research for this book, and how you can do your own research, let's walk through some of the most important concepts for understanding science. 1. Science is a process. The scientific method allows us to observe the world in a systematic, objective way. Children learn the scientific method starting in elementary school, and I have fond memories of conducting my science fair experiments and preparing my presentation with question, hypothesis, prediction, experimental method, data, and conclusions in big stenciled letters. This seems like a pretty simple system, and it is. It is exactly this simplicity and its systematic approach that makes it so valuable. It means that other scientists can repeat the experiment to verify it or not, and still others might change one or two variables to determine how they affect the results. What really makes it meaningful is that we all use the same process, and over time it helps us to better understand the world. Good science takes lots of experiments, time, and people to build a body of knowledge. But it always starts in the same place, with a question and the desire to answer it. 2. Good science is peer-reviewed. A critical part of the scientific process is peer review and publication of results. Someone may be a brilliant scientist, conducting groundbreaking research in her lab, but if she doesn't publish her results, then they are essentially meaningless. Her data will die when she dies. Publication is a permanent record of scientific discovery. When studies are published, other researchers can check the work and build on it. If a scientist wants to publish her research, she has to write it up in a research paper and submit it to a scientific journal. Journals, especially the best ones, receive many more papers than they actually publish, and they're selective about what they accept. If the editor thinks a paper could be a good fit for the journal, it will be subjected to peer review. This means that experts, usually 3 or 4, in that specific area of research, will read and critique the paper. They'll check to see whether the researcher used good methodology and statistics to test her hypothesis, and whether her interpretations of the results are reasonable. Peer reviewers aren't paid to do this job, but they take the responsibility seriously, knowing that the legitimacy of their field of research rests on good peer review. They're also usually anonymous, so they can freely offer their opinions and concerns without fear of damaging relationships with other scientists. The peer review system is a filter for bad science. Flawed studies won't get published, although this means they are often resubmitted to a lower-quality journal. Peer reviewers often ask authors to collect more data, analyze it in a different way, or consider alternative explanations for the results. The purpose of peer review is to keep everyone honest and to keep the standards of scientific publication high. If you're looking to science for answers to your parenting questions, be sure you're looking at peer-reviewed science. Most scientific journals are peer-reviewed, but you can check journal web pages to be sure. Letters to the editor and commentaries published in journals aren't usually peer-reviewed. 3. One study is never all that meaningful on its own. What matters is scientific consensus. Scientific knowledge has to start somewhere, but one study is never worth much on its own, even after peer review. Scientists can make mistakes, use flawed methodology, or simply misinterpret their data. So we like to see studies repeated and hypotheses tested in different ways before we get too excited about results. Andrew Wakefield's paper attempting to link the measles, mumps, and rubella (MMR) vaccine to autism is a dramatic example of this. Wakefield's study used methodology that was weak and ethically questionable, and it didn't actually provide evidence that the MMR shot caused autism. Somehow it got through peer review and was published in The Lancet, a prestigious journal. But since scientists are never satisfied with one study, more researchers studied this question, looking at it from different angles and using better methods, and their results didn't support Wakefield's findings. We now have a huge amount of science showing that Wakefield was wrong, and his paper was retracted, essentially removing it from the archives of reputable science. More on that story in Appendix D. So while the system of science isn't foolproof, it is usually self-correcting over time. One study can't tell us much on its own, but scientific consensus means we're getting closer to really understanding something. If you put a bunch of scientists together in a room, what do 95% of them agree on? If only a couple of studies have been conducted on the topic, you're likely to hear a lot of debate and disagreement in the room. Scientists are skeptical by nature, after all. But over time, as different scientists using different methodologies conduct more and more studies, a consensus emerges. For example, there is a strong scientific consensus that evolution explains the diversity of life, that global warming is happening because of human activity, and that the benefits of vaccines far outweigh the risks. Our understanding of these ideas will continue to grow and evolve, but they're unlikely to change radically because they are already backed by so many studies. Other areas of science have less certainty. Some examples discussed in this book are the safety of bed sharing, Chapter 6, and the right time to start solid foods, Chapter 9. These questions are hotly debated in scientific communities. That's a sign to us that maybe the data are not so solid, and there are some aspects of these topics that science hasn't explained very well yet. Researchers arguing about these questions drives the field forward and urges them to conduct better studies, and it tells us that there's room within evidence-based parenting to make different choices. 4. Some studies are more valuable than others. The great thing about the Internet is that we all have scientific databases at our fingertips. You can search PubMed or Google Scholar for your topic of interest and have access to millions of scientific abstracts, summaries of research papers, and in some cases you can even access the full text. Unfortunately, unless you are affiliated with an academic institution, many journals will require you to pay a hefty fee for a copy of the article. Access to millions of articles is useful only if you can make sense of them. Let's say you're wondering when you should introduce solid foods to your baby, so you search PubMed for Infant Solid Foods Introduction. You get 392 results. You know that most of these articles have passed a certain degree of scrutiny already, since they are published in peer-reviewed journals. But is each of these 392 articles equally important? How do you figure out which are most relevant and helpful? Important factors to consider are the type of article and the study design. Here's a quick guide, listed roughly in order from most to least relevant for answering your parenting and health questions. Systematic reviews and meta-analyses. A systematic review is a survey of studies published on a specific topic or question. Its purpose is to try to summarize what the research says collectively about the topic. The authors systematically search scientific databases for studies of the topic, and then they whittle down their results to include the studies that are most relevant and of highest quality, using predetermined criteria. Following their methods, if you had access to the same scientific databases, you should be able to end up with the same collection of studies. The authors of the systematic review report on the overall findings, giving you a summary of the field, including where results are conflicting. This type of paper is useful because it interprets a lot of studies and puts them in context with each other. You will also find review papers that aren't systematic, but these are less reliable because the authors may have cherry-picked studies that they liked and left others out. A meta-analysis is usually a systematic review that goes one step further, combining the quantitative data from each of the relevant studies and conducting a statistical analysis on these combined data. A well-known and reliable source for systematic reviews and meta-analyses is the Cochrane Collaboration, an international non-profit organization that asks experts to conduct reviews using very rigorous methods for the purpose of informing evidence-based medicine. If you're looking for information about when to start solid foods, for example, you're in luck, because there is a Cochrane review on a closely related topic, the optimal duration of exclusive breastfeeding, comparing 4 versus 6 months. Randomized Controlled Trials, RCTs. An RCT is the highest quality design for a clinical trial. In an RCT, researchers recruit a group of people who first agree to participate in the study and are then randomly allocated to 2 or more groups, one of which is a control group. For example, an RCT published in 2013 investigated the question of when to start solid foods. A group of exclusively breastfeeding moms in Iceland were randomized to receive advice to start solid foods at either 4 months or 6 months, and then their babies were observed through infancy and into childhood. Because they were randomly assigned, these 2 groups should have been very similar in every way except for the time when the babies started solid foods. If the babies that started solid foods at 4 months had different measures of later growth or health than the babies that started solids at 6 months, then we would feel fairly certain that the timing of solids caused those differences. RCTs are really valuable, but they are also difficult and often unethical to do in parenting research. Most parents don't want a scientist to dictate to them how they should raise their baby, and if we already have data showing that one way is better than another, it would be unethical to tell some parents to use the less healthful method. Observational human studies. Most parenting studies are observational. On the question of when to start solid foods, I have found only 3 RCTs conducted to date, but hundreds of observational studies, including several categories described below. The most important thing to understand about all of these types of observational studies is that they can only show correlations. They can't provide evidence for causation. More on this in a minute. A cross-sectional study of this topic might look at a bunch of babies at the same age, maybe 12 months, providing a snapshot comparison of health and growth in babies who started solid foods earlier or later. A cohort study would observe these babies longitudinally, over time, giving us more information about how variables interact and change as the babies grow. Observational studies can only tell us so much, however, because we don't know how the babies that started solids early or late, or their parents, may have been different from the outset. For example, maybe the babies whose parents gave them solids at 4 months were also bigger to start with, or were growing more quickly all along. And maybe they were more interested in solids and more developmentally ready to try them earlier on. This growth pattern could affect both the decision of when to start solids and the outcomes later in the baby's life. It's really hard to tease out these variables, called confounding factors. Another type of observational study is a case control study, in which subjects are identified that have something in common, usually a medical condition or outcome, and are compared with controls that don't have that condition. Case control studies are discussed in detail in Chapter 6 on sleep safety and SIDS. The least useful type of observational study is a case report, a report of a single medical occurrence. For example, a pediatrician might write a case report on a baby who was allergic to rice cereal. This tells you that this allergy can occur and how it appeared in that one baby. Important information.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?